Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Maltby. I'm chair of the OCTC Civic Engagement Committee, and we are sponsoring today's program. Before I get too far along, I do want to thank a couple of people, Bernie Hale and Donna Abel, who were instrumental in making this happen. Each year on the 17th of September, we commemorate the signing of the U.S. Constitution, which occurred back in 1787 with a program that explores issues related to the creation of the document, the establishment of our federal government, and the application of the Constitution's principles in today's society. We are fortunate enough today to have as our speaker one of our own history professors who has a keen interest in these topics. Angela Ash's story began in alligator and snake-infested Florida. At least that's what I remember her telling me. I may be paraphrasing, but you know, that was pretty much it. Eventually, wow. Eventually, though, she and her family moved to Owensboro, and Angela enrolled here at Owensboro, at what was at the time Owensboro Community College, and she excelled as a history major at OCTC. She went on to get her bachelor's degree from Brescia University, her master's degree from the University of Louisville. She claims the fact that she is dressed in red and black today to be merely coincidental, but I have my doubts. As a student, she was a student of mine some time ago, and Angela displayed the interest and the enthusiasm that she maintains today. And I think you'll see that in her presentation today, which is on the European origins of the U.S. Constitution. So please welcome Angela Ash.
All right, can everybody hear me? All right. Thank you, Dr. Maltby. That was a very gracious introduction. I also want to thank the Civic Engagement Committee for asking me to do this. It's quite an honor. The U.S. Constitution is really a grand experiment, and I figure probably a lot of you already know that, but our founders really had a unique opportunity, and that is to build from historical precedents and do what they said they were going to do, form a more perfect union, to kind of build from lessons from the past. And so when I was asked to do this, do a Constitution Day presentation, my mind immediately went to what is to me obvious, which is the European origins of the Constitution, to look at, those precedents that had been set. Obviously it's a fact that the United States is part of the Western tradition. That's something that we really can't deny. And we are in many ways one of Europe's greatest legacies. And I don't think that's arrogant to say that. I think that's pretty accurate. And we learned from them, we learned from their successes, we learned from their failures, and we took this into account when forming our own government. So those were some of the things I considered when I started this presentation, but let me give you all an indication of what we're going to be looking at today. There's four major influences that I just kind of drew out of history to discuss with you all today. This is not a comprehensive discussion of all of the influences, or you all would be here for the next couple of weeks, okay? And I have a class to teach at 12:30, so we can't do that, okay? So what I've done here, and I'll try not to stay away from the mic very much, but you can kind of see the stars up here on this map. For this side of the room, I'm probably standing in front of the map, and I apologize for that. But you can see there's a star over Italy, there's a star over Greece, there's a star over France, and there's a star over England. And you have this really these highlighted areas because, in Athens, you have the birthplace of democracy. For Rome, you have, of course, the development of the Roman Republic, which is something we're going to look at today. And I pick out England because of the obvious, English-speaking constitutional influence there that we're going to discuss. And then France, and I pinpoint France because France is historically regarded as the birthplace of the Enlightenment movement, which, as many of my students know, I'm pretty emphatic about this, the Enlightenment pretty much made the American Revolution happen, okay? So that's pretty essential to our discussion. So let's keep up with our plan, and let's consider Athens first, okay? we consider Athens as the birthplace of democracy. The word demos and kratia, power and people, vesting that power into the hands of a group of people. This is an extraordinary thing. The Athenians are also uniquely suited to this kind of government because of their geography. And I see some of my students in here today. So what do we always say about geography in class? Yeah, I heard it. Geography is destiny, okay? It's destiny. It impacts some of the things that we might take for granted. But in the case for Athens, it impacts the kind of government that they embrace. The Greek terrain makes larger connections more difficult. So Athens, it's like roughly the size of the state of Rhode Island, okay? So when you consider it's not flat land, it's that, localized communities are going to rise up, and it's going to promote a life of unusual political intensity. You don't really see that. When you look back through the centuries, you have top-down systems abound, where there's a king on top and he's sort of delegating, and leading from above is rather what I should say. But in Athens, they pioneered this idea that there should be participation in government, and that average people should have a connection to these issues that are going to directly impact them, that they have a responsibility to be informed. And it's kind of an exciting story, so let's tell it. I'm going to go ahead and click through here the whole slide, just so you can have the whole big picture here. The story begins here. Athens really didn't start off as a democracy. It's not something that's just sort of, magically happens. It's a very, very long process. It takes centuries to put it into place. Athens originally had a king. Should sound a little familiar, right? But they had originally had a king, but he was forced out by aristocrats. The Greek word aristos means best. They were the elites in society. They threw out their king. By the 7th century BCE, these aristocrats formed this group known as archons. These 9 archons sort of worked together to govern Athens. But there was one of these archons that emerged in the 7th century BCE, a gentleman by the name of Solon. And I have him up here on the presentation. Solon was, I love his title, he was a poet, but also a general. Isn't that fantastic, right? It's like, shouldn't that be a requirement for military figures, belt out a sonnet, The English faculty are nodding, yes, absolutely, yes. But it's a symbol, really, of the Greek idea of balance and harmony and proportion, intellectual capacity, but also physical ability, too. But Solon, he really wanted to reform the Athenian system for the sake of really his own political position, right? It's like the old joke, he was an ambitious politician. Is there any other kind, right? There isn't. So what he does is he wins popular support over the aristocratic interests by leading reforms. One of the first things he does is he allows all free men to participate in the public assembly. All of them can come. There's a council of 400 created that represented the wealthy, and there were income requirements for this too. And he abolished enslavement as a way to pay off debts, which was a common method of dealing with paying back, money that you owed. You would serve as a slave for a time, and once you had basically, paid off your debt through service, you could be let go. But, Solon ends that. It's one of his major reforms that makes him so popular with the people. He also canceled all public and private debt to ease the burden on farmers, which, of course, when you cancel debt like that, it's going to make you very popular with the people that owed all those debts, right? So his reforms really break with his world's traditional pattern of government. It's an enormous departure from what had been there for centuries in the Greek world and elsewhere. And let me give you a quote from Solon. It's conveniently not in Greek. He says, "People abide by their agreements when neither side has anything to gain by breaking them. I am writing laws for the Athenians in such a way that they will clearly see it is to everyone's advantage to obey the laws rather than to break them." Unquote. And so Solon would get, foreigners would come and visit Athens, and they'd kind of make fun of the system. He's like, look, I know what I'm doing. If people feel like they have a measure of participation in government, they are more likely to cooperate. So he discovers something that really we've been building on for centuries. It's really an extraordinary thing. After Solon's death, though, class conflict ensued. We know that Athens was it was inundated with these clans, these family rivalries, and it usually just added all kinds of problems politically to Athens. And so we have this power vacuum. And there's a gentleman next on my list. Oh, what did I do? Sorry. I meant to do this. Pisistratus, who's next on my list here, he is the next person to kind of contribute to this stage of development of pure Athenian democracy. It's a little ironic that we would refer to someone as a tyrant contributing to the development of democracy. It's interesting, but Pisistratus, when we look at the sources, he is called a tyrant because he sees power by force as like an emergency measure. As after the chaos ensued after the death of Solon, he sort of fills that vacuum. And he brings back a lot of Solon's reforms. He retains his constitution. He initiates public works projects like the Temple of Zeus, and with the idea of making the people happy. With the idea of personal aggrandizement too. Pisistratus was really looking to establish his family as kind of a monarchy, essentially. But he gains popular support, and that's the key, right? He understands that if the people feel like he is on their side, that it's going to lead to great things for everybody involved. But he expanded trade, he developed the Athenian navy, and was heralded as a benevolent figure for the most part. But the fact that he retained Solon's reforms was the big deal, right? But when Pisistratus died, his sons took over. He had one son by the name of Hippias who just was self-interested and cruel and was eventually ousted with little help from nearby Sparta. So another power vacuum. Who's going to scramble for the top leadership position in Athens now? Well, this comes in the form of Cleisthenes, who is regarded as the father of Athenian democracy. And what he does is takes it a step farther. He could have stayed a tyrant like Pisistratus. He could have stayed in that position where he had ultimate authority. But what he does is he decides that for the Athenians, a better system would be to create a form of what we call radical democracy or pure democracy. Now, is that what we have in the United States? Do we have a pure radical? No. There's a lot of logistical reasons why that wouldn't work. But in the mind of Cleisthenes, this complex political reorganization, it has to happen by redistricting Athens, getting rid of those, clan rivalries, class rivalries. So he promoted the idea that you can have a more stable system by involving as many adult men in the electoral process as possible. So what he does is he rotates Athenian governing power basically on these political units called demes or places. So it's not based on who your dad is anymore, right? Or your family name or anything like that. It's based on where you live. And think of these demes as like precincts. And like I said, think small. Athens is pretty small, right? So you're dividing up these little precincts where you're going to have eventually, if you're an adult male citizen, an opportunity to serve in the Council of 500. You have the assembly, which is the assembly where all adult males can participate, and they met frequently to make decisions. But the Council of 500, think of it as like a House of Representatives, essentially, and you could be called in to serve there. All adult males could expect to serve at least 1 year there in the Council of 500, also known as the Boule. But it'd be like, Dr. Klobber, you get a letter in the mail today, and guess what? You get to take Brett Guthrie's place. It's your turn, right? You got to go, okay? So this idea of civic duty, this idea of service, it's essential to this notion of Athenian democracy, pure democracy, radical democracy. Now, was this a perfect system? No. This is not a system that has anything that we're familiar with enumerated rights or freedom of speech or those sorts of things. Ask Socrates about that and freedom of speech, right? Socrates didn't really enjoy that, right? So we have to keep this in mind. There are clear problems in the system. Cleisthenes also, I could tell you something bad about him, came up with a system called ostracizing, where a person could either be kicked out of the city or killed. So we have to keep this in mind too. But this system, this is kind of a cool thing. This lasts for 500 years. This is longer than any democratic style system has yet survived. So, we've got a while before we can challenge the Greeks for that slot, okay? But this is where the idea is born, to promote involvement in the political process. The word politics in our lexicon, the root word there is polis, city, okay? Because as Aristotle said, men are by nature political beings and they're going to want to actively get involved. So we start here. Now moving on. Let's go to Rome in the Roman Republic. Rome we more strongly identify with. I think our system is more reminiscent of the Roman Republican system. Certainly our founding fathers studied the ins and outs of the Roman Republican system, and I'll get to that in a minute. But just for introduction's sake, the city of Rome is founded in 753 BCE. But just like with Athens, it's not, everyone woke up one day and, we're going to have a republic. It takes time for this process to develop. It took time in Athens. It took time in Rome. The Roman Republic, as we know it in history, doesn't form until 509 BCE, when the Etruscans were finally driven out of the city. The Etruscans were, for the Romans, public enemy number one. They built the first cities in Italy, but for the Roman standpoint, they were an oppressive group and had to be overthrown. Again, you could draw the parallel with, say, the American colonists in their fight against King George III. The idea that they needed to overthrow a tyrant and create a system that they were directly participating in. So what is a republic? Well, we could argue that, just a generic definition of a republic is a state without a monarch ruled by the combination of, say, a Senate and its citizens. And you all probably noticed on the flyer that was used to promote this event, this funky acronym, SPQR, which everybody was asking me what that means. And SPQR is, of course, a Latinized acronym, Senatus Populus Romanus. It's the Senate and the people of Rome, which was at the heart of the Republican system. Sure, there was a military concentration of power in Rome, sure. But we want to kind of break down this system. The Romans actually devised what is truly a balanced separation of powers system, or what Polybius, my buddy up here that we'll talk about in a minute, called a mixed constitution, right? What they did is they had a Senate, okay? A little bit more useful than our own maybe at times, but the Senate was composed of upper class men from the patrician class. You had two basic classes in Roman society. Patricians, they were the heads, or sort of the nobility, derived from the Latin word pater, meaning father. And then the plebeians, which constituted about 90% of the population. So the Senate, at the start of the Republic, because the Roman Republic goes through changes and evolution, just like our own has, okay? But it was originally comprised of 300 men, all from the patrician class. The General Assembly was meant to represent the plebeian classes, or the commoners. And basically they represented, the political affairs of the state, sort of delegated that to the General Assembly, but it was an electorate. They would be voted in. So chief executives, if you're looking for a position that would be analogous to, say, like a president, for the Romans it was the consuls. And there were always two, and they had the power of veto over each other. Veto is Latin for I forbid. And there was always one consul out in the field, commanding rooms, armies, whereas there was always one at home. But this is truly, folks, a checks and balances system. On paper, or on theory. It's not to say it didn't always work that way. We've had moments in our history, too, in the United States where you have one branch that seems to sort of hijack the others. But the Romans had those kinds of troubles, too. But this is a system that our founders studied very closely. And eventually in 287 BCE, the plebeians and the patricians had equal voting rights and supposedly equal access to offices. But in reality, it's just like you could argue with any other system. It's typically the wealthy and the powerful that dominate. This is the way it is, okay? So this democratic style system fails in Rome, just like it eventually does in Athens. For Rome, we know what ends up happening. The people choose security over liberty in the form of the acceptance of Augustus Caesar as sort of this imperial monarchy, which we won't have time to get into. But what I think is fascinating about this, too, is that there's a historian who's a favorite of mine that left for us the very best records about the Roman Republic and what was going on there. And his name is Polybius. And our founders loved Polybius. Did you all know that? John Adams wrote extensively on Polybius. Found him to be just a great source of inspiration. And Polybius, he wrote the histories, this great piece about, the heights of Roman Republican power. And he's really a product of the Hellenistic world, too, so he knew Greek as well as Roman very well. But he theorized that when you have a single constitution, and I mean constitution with a little c, right? When you have a single form of government, like monarchy, he says it'll naturally turn into the worst version of itself. It'll become some tyrannous, horrible government, okay? Same thing with this, aristocracy, rule by the best, right? Rule by the elites. He says it's going to turn into some oppressive oligarchy, some oppressive despotic oligarchy with self-interested men. And he said, and if you have democracy, it has the potential to slip into mob rule. We didn't really talk about that with Athens, but Athens did, especially during the Peloponnesian War. Athens sort of lost her way and just sort of policies were driven towards the passions of the masses, which is not necessarily the most effective method to govern. So even democracy can turn into something ugly and horrible. So Polybius argues that what you have to do to sort of make up for the defects of the single constitution is you have to have some kind of combination where there's a separation of powers, where there's a checks and balances, where we have what he calls a mixed constitution. Okay? Let me give you some quotes here real quick. We'll turn this into a primary source session for the next 5 minutes, okay? Let's look at this quote together. For when one part, having grown out of proportion to the others, aims at supremacy and tends to become too predominant, it is evident that, as for the reasons above given, none of these three is absolute, but the purpose of the one can be counterworked and thwarted by the others. None of them will excessively outgrow the others or treat them with contempt. All, in fact, remains in status quo on the one hand, because any aggressive impulse is sure to be checked, and from the outset, each estate stands in the dread of being interfered with by the others. So long-winded, articulate way of saying you have to have this separation of powers, they have to have checks on each other, or one is going to try to dominate the other. And he's not the only one, though. I pick out Polybius as kind of a star here, but there's others, too. Aristotle was jack of all trades, probably one of my favorite philosophers. He's sort of interested in everything, and argued this, that the better the Constitution is mixed, the more permanent it is, which is another thing that our founders were really passionate about, this idea that how do we make this good thing that we're experimenting with last? And the best way to do that is to, again, as we said, mix the Constitution, mix the system. Cicero, another one of my favorites. Cicero met a tragic end, actually, for a lot of his views, but he lived from 106 BC to about 43 BC. And look at this quote. He says, a form of government which is an equal mixture of the three good forms is superior to any of them by itself. So what we really need to be aware of in the United States today is that, guess what? People a couple thousand years ago had already figured out this idea that having a separation of powers is the best way to ensure a stable government. It was a way to, ensure stability, a way to make it last. And you can follow it along pretty carefully in the story of Athens and the story of Rome, because when there is, for Rome in particular, when there's a breakdown in that separation of powers, everything falls apart. Everything falls apart. So that's our sojourn into the ancient world, okay? Most historians, when they write about this time period, they talk about how, for 2,000 years, really, democratic principles were just kind of left on the wayside and not really experimented with. We go next to England to look at a document that also has had enormous impact on the United States, and that is the Magna Carta. How many of you all have been to the National Archives building to see the U.S. Constitution, by show of hands? How many of you all have seen that? Okay. How many of you all noticed that when you went into the National Archives building, off to the right-hand side, the historians that work there, which I envy those people, but they have a facsimile of the Magna Carta. Anybody ever notice that? Okay, Good. Did you ever wonder why? And I wondered that. I had the pleasure of taking my daughter there a couple of times, and I just wonder how many people mill past that to get to the documents, to get to, the Bill of Rights. And I understand that, but I wonder how many miss that essential bit of history. Because why does the Magna Carta matter to us? Let's tell the story. This document dates to 1215. During a very, very tumultuous time in England. England was reigned at this time by John I, who reigned from 1199 to 1216. John had the misfortune of having a brother, Richard the Lionheart, that we all know and love. Maybe you don't love him, but you know him. But, he had a huge debt that he had racked up, being on crusade for, several years of his reign, and John is sort of saddled with this. John also had to deal with the rise of France and the reclamation of French territory. Because the territory that John had lost that was so important to England was Normandy, right? So when John lost Normandy, he was on this relentless pursuit to get it back. At all costs, just get it back, and costs. And of course, war costs money, as we know very well in this country. So finally, there is a moment where the English barons sit John down. And this is probably a highly unpleasant moment for John. As you can see here up in this painting, he is forced to sign this in this artist's rendition of this historic event. They basically sit him down and say, okay, you can't just do whatever you want. Okay? It's a charter of baronial liberties. It's a statement limiting the power of the king. Just that the king is not above the law, and that there are certain things that he has to take into account. You just can't take advantage of his subjects. Eventually, the Magna Carta is regarded as basically a statement of rights of all Englishmen. Most historians that really get into this and study this note that the Magna Carta is for a while kind of forgotten about, and over time, we understand the significance of this. But to say to a king, "Hey, you're not above the law. You have to recognize the rights of your subjects," and in particular, in this case, the barons, who were kind of the heart and soul of John's kingdom. He couldn't alienate that faction and get away with it, right? So this sets England on the pathway of a limited monarchy, okay? This is really the beginning of that time. When we get to the point today where we see, Queen Elizabeth as the lovely lady that she is today, but does she really possess any political authority? No, right? She's a lovely figurehead. But we kind of see the origins of that constitutional monarchy beginning here in the Magna Carta, okay? But let's finish off here. We want to talk about the Petition of Right in 1628. This was issued, fast forward with me, a few centuries into the future here. Charles I, who reigned from 1625 to 1649, had the misfortune of coming across a very aggressive parliament that was full of Puritans who were interested in reform, not just religious reform, but political reform too. Because at this stage in England's history, you basically had a king that was desperate to try to become a divine right monarch, to possess power, basically, equal to that of the will of God, which is absolutely out of accordance with the English precedent. The English have something we call, at this point in history, a balanced polity, where Parliament and the king were supposed to work together, coordinate together to govern England for the greater good. Charles was cut from the cloth of the Stuart line of kings. His dad, James I, you all have probably heard of before, very much well, let me give you a quote from James I. He said that God called kings gods. So that's humble guy, right? Really, yeah. So that is kind of infused in Charles I's mind that, I can roll without Parliament if I need to, right? So, but this Petition of Right is signed in 1628. Why is it significant? The petition states, guess what, Your Majesty? You can't force the billeting of soldiers. You can't, imprison people without cause. There's restrictions on the Crown's ability to tax. And we see these same kind of concerns come up with, of course, in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. 3rd, 5th, 6th, and 7th Amendments. In turn, the Third Amendment, of course, deals with quartering soldiers without consent. You could, clearly inspired from the English precedent here. Fifth, the right to due process of law, which is also addressed in this petition of right. And the sixth, the right to a speedy trial. Seventh, guarantee of trial by jury. Things that were in one way or another addressed in this petition of right. So what Parliament was essentially trying to do there was create a structured, balanced polity, more specific balanced polity between the king and Parliament. What we need to understand is that the English didn't really have a written constitution the way we possess one today. It was more or less understood in tradition and precedent and English, legal tradition. So the petition of right was an attempt to sort of state those. But Charles I, his answer to this is to just not call Parliament into session for 11 years. He's like, don't need them, from 1629 to 1640, I'll just do things myself, right? Which plunged the nation into civil war. But even that civil war doesn't really fully define the contours of the relationship between Parliament and their king. What does is that, the English Bill of Rights in 1689. The Glorious Revolution, as we refer to this movement, is the big byproduct of that movement known as the Glorious Revolution. Let me tell you that real quick. The story goes, again, back to the House of Stuart. We're not done with the Stuarts yet, right? James II ascended the throne in 1685, reigned until 1688, real short reign. His problem, really, glaring him in the face was the fact that he had decided to raise his male heir Catholic, right? But England at this stage was populated the majority of what branch of Christianity? Anybody know? Really, the Anglican, right? The Protestant traditions. There were different Protestant traditions sort of competing for attention too. But, James II was openly Catholic. And there were many in Parliament that just decided to sort of deal with this as long as there wasn't a promise of a Catholic dynasty. Well, when James had a son, guess what? That meant his two older Protestant daughters were no longer first in line for the throne. That meant his son, who was going to be raised Catholic, sort of an in-your-face moment from James II. I'm going to raise my son Catholic, and we're going to have this Catholic dynasty forever, in perpetuity. So Parliament rises up. Enough is enough. Okay. He is deposed. James II is deposed. He doesn't have his head chopped off like Charles I did. He gets to keep his head on his shoulders. But he is run out basically to France, where he regroups his forces and tries to come back to the throne later, which is another story we won't get into. But what is important about this, and what makes this a glorious revolution, is it's a virtually bloodless transition of power from one group to another. In many ways, James II fleeing the country is the end of the hope ever of England having any kind of divine right monarchy. It's gone. It's over. Because with the invitation of William and Mary to the throne, which this lovely lady that you see there, Mary, happened to be James II's eldest daughter, raised Protestant from a different marriage. And so she, along with her husband, William III, he'll be William III, they are invited to rule. That's the key word there, invited to rule. And they have to accept this Bill of Rights as a condition, right? So it's basically a way of solving those problems that we've seen since, the early 17th century. Finally, a way to specify the relationship between Parliament and the Crown. And so what's included in this English Bill of Rights? We thought we were the first group to have a Bill of Rights, didn't we? We're not. The English are, okay? And their Bill of Rights included a statement that said, Parliament has to meet every 3 years, at least every 3 years, and that's to combat, what had happened during the reign of Charles I, which was, I'm just going to not call Parliament into session. The hope in this Bill of Rights is that will be prevented, and that, the king cannot raise an army without Parliament's consent. That there's basically, finally, power in Parliament, and power in Parliament to kind of check the authority of the king. It's not a perfect balance of power or separation of power system. It's not as specific as the one the United States will eventually embrace, but it is a form of checks and balances system, where Parliament at least has these checks on the monarchy. It's an extraordinary thing. And, they call this the Glorious Revolution in English history because it was considered this this great moment, this triumph for the people in England. And it doesn't go as far as the American model, though. I wanted to make sure I pointed that out. In all fairness, there is no provision for religious toleration. Certainly the American model is going to go much farther, but this idea that there should be stated rights is an enormous triumph in the story of English history. Now, there's a wonderful segue between this glorious revolution and the next movement that I want to consider with you all, the Enlightenment, okay? There are many historians, I tend to agree with this view, that the glorious revolution helps inspire a lot of the optimism that we see come through in the Enlightenment. So let's explain what the Enlightenment is here just for a minute, right? My students know that I love to do like political, diplomatic, military history. I like to do that, but I think it's kind of a good break for me to get into some of this intellectual history too, and to kind of see that during this Enlightenment period, you have these sort of explosion of thought and all these things that are considered all at one time. But let's consider the story. The Enlightenment movement is also called the Age of Reason, right? And as I said, it has its origins in the late 17th century, but it really only reaches its full potential in the mid to later part of the 18th century. And what this movement is, it's a grassroots intellectual movement aimed at the progress and perfectibility of mankind, to use reason to solve real-world problems. It comes actually right after the initial phase of the scientific revolution, which preached empiricism, the idea that you rely on direct observation to determine reality. So you have that practical application of that for these Enlightenment scholars that we lovingly refer to as philosophes, these philosophers, wanting to take scientific models to solve real-world problems. And of course, for them, this also meant government. This meant, if we could look back through history and really come up with the best form of government, if we could just look back and study the past and see, look at the evidence that's there and research and, bounce ideas around each other, that's really what Enlightenment scholars did. I like to think that if the Enlightenment happened today, that these Enlightenment scholars would be hanging out at Starbucks, or, just sitting around philosophizing, drinking coffee, and, but the power of the Enlightenment movement was not in universities and colleges, because those were controlled by the church for the most part. This was truly a grassroots movement, and it was a movement that covered Western culture. You had philosophers from Moscow to Philadelphia and everywhere in between that are participating in this. It just happens to be born in France because France was, the intellectual language of the day, and certainly a center of great absolutist monarchical oppression. So what do they want to do? As I said, use science and reason to solve problems in politics and economics, but they were interested in everything from botany to, all kinds of different things. But another thing that I always want to impart to my students is that no two philosophers were alike. They had different views, they had different perspectives, and some were very much against organized religion, others were not. But the common denominator is they all wanted progress. They all wanted to improve the human condition. And they believed in human potential to do that, okay? So I just picked a couple of, we could, again, be here all day with a list of philosophers that, had a great contribution to history. But John Locke and the Barons of Montesquieu are two fellows that I've picked from this list. John Locke, I often joke with my students, I say that if, Thomas Jefferson had been in my class and submitted the Declaration of Independence, I would have knocked him off for plagiarism from John Locke's Second Treatise on Government. Because it's just in lockstep with the Lockean playbook. It's so full of Locke's ideas and Locke's theories. So let's meet him. Locke lived from 1632 to 1704, and he rejected, the philosophical rationales for government that were in existence in his time. And when I say philosophical rationale for government, I mean, the purpose, the role of government, what it's supposed to do, how it's supposed to be structured. Locke's coming out of an age where divine right monarchy was the standard. That was the view that was common. One of the debates that were out, though, at the time during Locke's period was where that power comes from. Does the king derive his power from God? Does he derive his power from the consent of the governed, also known as social contract theory? Okay? Locke liked social contract theory. He liked that idea of the consent of the governed, but only on the basis that it formed the foundation for constitutionalism. That's his view. He argues that basically the governments should be in place to protect rights, natural rights. But Locke's life experience has a lot to do with his perception of this too. Locke, he was a physician's secretary and an intellectual companion to a man by the name of the Earl of Shaftesbury. And in 1683, Locke actually fled with him to the Dutch Republic during the time when Charles II clamped down on those conspiring to prevent James II from coming to the throne. Back to that glorious revolution discussion we had just a moment ago. But while Locke was there, hanging out there in the Dutch Republic, it's when he writes these two revolutionary pieces, the two treatises on government, which he publishes later in 1690. And those pieces serve to basically justify England's glorious revolution. It's kind of a cheerleading moment for him. Like, oh, look at what triumphed here. Liberty triumphed here in the glorious revolution. And he was sort of celebrating that. And definitely an anti-absolutist. He denied the divide right of kings and absolutely ridiculed those that embraced it. He really thought that human nature was inherently good. And so when he would theorize with his fellow philosophers, this idea of the state of nature, this fictitious place that, what would it be like in the absence of government? Whereas many of those who defended absolutism said that, life in the state of nature was a horrible place, cruel, nasty, brutish, and short. Locke says, no, it's a positive place. But the government, the sole purpose of the government is to protect those rights that come to you from nature. It's important to note, he says you are born with these. So this is important because that means no man should be able to take them away from you. Not a king, not anybody. And so, you think of the words of the Declaration of Independence, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. This whole idea is so much from Locke's philosophical rationale for government. And so that means that a ruler that fails to uphold his part of the social contract could be justifiably resisted, i.e. George III, right? So we have to consider that a government's only purpose is to protect life, liberty, and property. There's another interesting thing here too, and that is that this links economic and political freedom, which we like to think that's also something that we do in the U.S. Constitution, right? So, and there's another point here about Locke too, and then we'll move on. He asserts that each human is born with a mind that is a blank slate, the famous tabula rasa reference. Everything humans know comes from sensory experience and not from, anything inherent. But that is an underlying message in favor of this concept of equality, the idea that we're born equal, which is another important thing. Now, was Locke perfect? No. You're looking at the chief stockholder in the Royal African Company here, someone who made lots of money off of slavery. Okay, he's not a perfect man, but did certainly inspire our founders and of course subsequently led to greater things. Last guy on our list here, Baron de Montesquieu. This is, by the way, one of my favorite quotes from the 18th century. Baron de Montesquieu argues that a nation may lose its liberties in a day and not miss them in a century. And again, building on historical precedent, Montesquieu wrote a piece titled The Spirit of the Laws, which was published in 1748. And the book, it's almost like a review of Polybius and his discussion of the different single constitutions and how any single form of constitution can turn into the worst version of itself. So through this spirit of the laws, what he's basically advocating in favor of is separation of powers. And our founders were familiar with both, okay? So I know I'm kind of running out of time here, so let me just point out a few things, and we're almost done. When we look at the establishment of the U.S. Constitution, I kind of envy those people that were around during that time in the late 18th century, around all that concentration of brilliance and genius and tenacity and dedication, commitment to say, okay, guys, we can start from scratch. We can do anything we want to do. We can pull from all these historical precedents to come up with the best system. Let's look, let's read, let's research. It has been said by more than one historian that you don't have anywhere else in history, in American history in particular, a higher concentration of those who are classically educated. Let me jump ahead to this quote here from Dr. Simmons. He says, "It is no accident then that so many who gathered at Philadelphia to declare independence and a decade later to draft a constitution were men who had apprenticed themselves." Not just read, he says apprenticed themselves to Thucydides, probably the best historian of the ancient world, Plato, Aristotle, Polybius, and Cicero, and who could debate at length on the various constitutional forms of the classical world before they chose one for the new American nation. We owe our very existence as a people in great part to classical learning. And so, when the Constitutional Convention creates the Constitution signed September 17, 1787, and then ratified in 1788, and the first full year implemented in 1789, they're, again, building on the past, trying something remember the lines from the Constitution, a more perfect union, trying to build on those precedents and make something better and make it last. That was another thing, another key point, and this is also a concern of Polybius's, to make this system last. Finally, when we hear these politicians, say things like, we have this sort of pride, I think, in the United States with, this idea that we were the birthplace of democracy, and every once in a while we'll catch our leaders saying, "Oh, it's the birthplace of democracy, birthplace of democracy." You now know differently, don't you? And you have this sense that, our founding fathers don't just pull this stuff out of the air, and it's not, things that they make up on their own. It is truly the diligent work and research of these men who are absolutely committed to creating the best system of government that they knew how. And that's what we get.